Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Again, good evening, everybody. This is the full moon, the end of what we call the rainy season in the calendar that has three major seasons, each 4 months long. And it's the beginning of the cold season. And now many of you, no matter where you are experiencing some of that, whether it's just slightly chillier or whether snowflakes are just around the corner. Here we've got a nice transition into autumn. It's been still quite warm, but also the leaves have more or less fallen. And we're right there. Yeah, it's a time of great change, time of great, the sense of wrapping things up and the energy of the summer leaving and kind of getting ready for a time where we're moving more internally rather than being drawn out into external activities. So this tends to be also a time of resurgence in Dhamma practice. It's counterintuitive. You would think, when everybody's out and about, you'd be out and about going to meditations and to temples and this and that. But actually, there's so much to do that the meditation sometimes, gets bumped down the list. But when the environment forces us in, then it's usually a great opportunity for meditation, for taking things one step at a time, and for reassessing. We're also coming to the end of the year and saying, well, how did this year go? In terms of wrapping up loose ends, I've covered 3 of the 4 noble truths. And I thought tonight maybe we could tie off this loose end and look a little bit at the 4th noble truth. And it's a little thing that maybe some of you have heard of called the Noble Eightfold Path. So when the Buddha introduces the 4th noble truth, he introduces the Eightfold Path. They are one and the same. And he says, the 4th noble truth, the truth of the way to the cessation of dukkha, of suffering, is just this, namely right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right samadhi. And this is, it's a delightful thing, it's a wonderful thing. And in terms of the duty, as we call it, to this noble truth, again, the 4 noble truths each have their own respective duty, their own relationship that we cultivate towards them. With dukkha, we try to understand it. The cause of dukkha, craving, we try to abandon it. The end of dukkha, nirodha, we try to realize it. But the path to the end of dukkha, we try to cultivate. Bhavana, we try to develop this path to the end of dukkha. And now, since we covered the 3rd noble truth, I make a special point of recognizing that we're talking about nirodha. And so there's many possible ways of interpreting this idea of the end of dukkha. And of course, we're using the metaphor of a path. So it sounds like something quite linear, right? Like it's point A to point B. There's a departure and there's a destination. And it sounds very sequential, right? There are 8 steps. And any teacher will say that they're definitely they build on each other and they rely on each other. It is very difficult to have ones lower on the list be in balance if we don't have the ones higher on the list. Our view has to be in line with the 4 noble truths. Our intention has to be free of greed, hatred, and delusion. Our speech and actions, our livelihood has to be pure in order to get mindfulness and concentration. But nirodha is not simply that we're kind of cutting dukkha off. as though we're flipping a switch. As we pointed out, it's a nuanced thing. We're as interested in the non-arising of future dukkha as we are in the ending of our current dukkha. And it's one of those things like we covered with Bhava, our becoming, last Saturday, that some forms of our dukkha actually aren't going to end until the end of our life. Like the dukkha of aging, sickness, and death. Those are going to be here because they were conditioned by our birth. They were conditioned by us taking birth in this realm of aging, sickness, and death. So when we're talking about nirodha, or the end of suffering, in that terms, we can attain the end of the cause of our suffering. We can see to it that suffering will not arise in the future, but that won't finish up all of the pain and difficulty and challenge we might have in our life. But if we take this broader sense of nirodha, then it makes sense. What we're interested in is the non-arising of dukkha, the end of the conditions for the arising of dukkha. And that's what the Eightfold Path is really describing. And when we look at it in that context, a whole wealth of understanding kind of comes out of it. It's not a sequential thing. It's not a checklist. It's not okay, I've got right action. Now I can do right livelihood. Okay, I've got right livelihood. And anybody who's tried and kind of gone down the list and said, okay, yes, I believe in the Four Noble Truths. Okay, I'm not being greedy or malicious, and they got to the end, and no matter if they could check all 8 of them, they'd be like, yeah, I'm pretty concentrated. So then what? You don't instantly get enlightened, right? It would be great if you did. If you did, we would create these little camps where people would come and just start checking them off. And I've heard there are retreats where you can go on where you do the 4 foundations of mindfulness for 7 days straight. And at the end of it, you get this little certificate that says you're a stream enterer. Because how could one cultivate the 4 foundations of mindfulness for 7 days straight, diligently, ardently, resolutely, without becoming a stream enterer? It must have happened. So you'll get an actual certificate, and you can put it up on your wall. But now probably most of us are, we've given it a try, and maybe not just for 7 days, maybe not just for 7 months, maybe for 7 years or 7 decades. We've attended to these things, and it's not a one and done kind of thing. Yeah. So what is this Eightfold Path actually describing? And I think when we look in terms of nirodha, one thing that jumps to mind are the right efforts. So we have our existing suffering and the existing causes of suffering, based on greed, hatred, and delusion, but essentially stemming from craving, stemming from desire. And that desire, of course, dependent on our ignorance. If we understood these Four Noble Truths in their entirety, we would not have craving for things in the world. We would see things in the world as productive of suffering, and we would let them go. We would let that craving go. But that's what we're dealing with. We do have some craving. We do have some defilements. We're not perfect. We're a little unpolished. We're a work in progress. But that's just half of the scenario. Like the 2 right efforts, which are actually part of the Eightfold Path, which deal with making sure that our existing defilements end, and then looking that they don't arise in the future. But then we have 2 more right efforts that deal with the supporting conditions to be sure that our defilements don't arise in the future. And that is the cultivation of wholesome qualities, and the protection of the ones that we already have, the development of the ones that we already have. And this is what the Eightfold Path is actually describing. Not merely a checklist, not merely get this and you're enlightened, but a course of development that's fully fleshed out. in terms of showing us the places where we've got to attend to the existing causes of our suffering. Yeah. To the fullest degree that we can counteract them. And very interestingly, even though some forms of suffering are going to continue until the end of our life, aging, sickness, and death, taxes, war, hunger, thirst, the need to defecate and urinate, all of these things are going to continue to afflict us. The Eightfold Path still actually can be cultivated and perfected, even with those existing forms of suffering. Yeah. The essential defilements that cause future existences, like the one that we're going through, can all be eradicated. Yeah. It's that we don't have to wait until these things that afflict us are over. So all of the defilements of the mind that produce future existence, that produce future suffering, can be polished off. And if we look at the Eightfold Path, then we see clearly enunciated all of the things that we need to attend to. Um, some of them are clear and some are implied. So, which are the ones that are clear? Well, right intention, they're clear, right? So, what is right intention? Right intention is the intention of non-acquisition, or the intention of letting go or renunciation, the intention of non-ill will, and the intention of non-cruelty. Yeah, these are the three right intentions, and they're nons. Yeah, they're not this. So then it's obvious, right? We want to get rid of those things. Yeah. And we want to cultivate their opposites. What's the opposite of stinginess, greed, holding on? Well, it's letting go. What's the opposite of ill will? It's friendliness. What's the opposite of cruelty? It's compassion, right? Another one that is clear is right speech. So we practice right speech by not lying, not insulting, not gossiping, and not mindlessly chattering. And that last one usually gets people, they're like, it doesn't sound like, where do we draw the line? Well, it's dealing with defilement, right? So those are all things that we kind of know, right? We kind of feel the effect that they have. There's a lot of places where we assume that something is wrong. There's a lot of people who deal with, well, that's not totally right what I just said. Or is that right what I just said? When, I mean, the Noble Eightfold Path, that factor is just pointing to, do you know that it's wrong? If you know that it's wrong, if you know that it's false, if you know it's a lie, if you know you intended to be hurtful, don't do it. Don't do that part. And you have cut off the cause of future suffering in that regard. So that one's obvious. Another obvious one is right action. So right action is described as not killing, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct, and not, am I, it's just those three, yeah? I guess I'm showing it's been it's been a while. There's some overlapping lists there, but it's those three, yeah. Because the fourth one, obviously, right speech is already covered. And in terms of intoxicants, these are often it's part of the five precepts. It's part of the eight precepts, and it's essential to holding our sila in check. But in some parts of the lists, it's not included, because it's more of a gray area. The real problem with intoxicants is the way that it prohibits our ability to cultivate the rest of the path, namely right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. But it also often causes us to break the three first precepts and to use wrong speech. Yeah. So, whereas in some of the lists, intoxicants are not included in the five precepts, obviously the training of a Buddhist practitioner, it's there, it's obvious, it's implied. And right livelihood. So what is right livelihood? It's again, it's nons, the non-dealing in weapons, the non-dealing in poisons, the non-dealing in slaves, the non-dealing in animals for slaughter, and the non-dealing in intoxicants and drugs. Yeah. So these ones are really clear. If we can cut off the cause of suffering, the thing that's producing the suffering, that being our livelihood, our lifestyle, our actions, our speech, our intentions are off in a certain way, then we get the result immediately, a life that is more peaceful. So what's the positive side of that? Well, that's the easy part. Cultivating anything that is not within those categories is right action, is right speech, is right intention. Yeah. There's an infinite number of ways to cultivate renunciation, to live by, just letting go and sharing and being open-handed, being generous, being kind. Yeah. There's an infinite number of ways to be compassionate and empathetic. There's an infinite number of ways to be complimentary, to use speech that is gentle and pleasing and brings people together rather than tears them apart. Yeah. So that's the easy part. And which parts of the Eightfold Path are the subduing the defilements implied? Well, the first one, it's in reverse. So what is right view? Right view is the view of the Four Noble Truths, which is neat that you have the Eightfold Path, and the first part of it is the Four Noble Truths, the fourth noble truth, which is the Eightfold Path. So, it kind of contains itself, it's self-referential. But this shows how important, how vital the Four Noble Truths are to the whole Eightfold Path working, in terms of being able to shape our lives. If we don't see suffering, then we won't work to counteract suffering. If we're not working to counteract suffering, we're not cultivating the Eightfold Path. The two go hand in hand. And when the Buddha was asked, are there enlightened beings outside of his dispensation? He didn't say yes or no, but he said, you've got to see that it's like this. Wherever you will find enlightened beings, you will know they cultivated the Eightfold Path. So then you can't have an enlightened being without this understanding of the Four Noble Truths, because that's what shapes right intention. That's what directs the cause for right effort and livelihood. That's what makes the mindfulness and the concentration pure, yeah, and well directed, is this right view. And now I've brought up effort, mindfulness, and concentration. And these are also ones where the defilements are implied. Why? Because you don't really accomplish them until you have subdued the obstacles to them. So with mindfulness, what we subdue is heedlessness, mindlessness. What we subdue is all of the factors that we call the five hindrances. Yeah. And these have to be done in a basic way to develop the foundations of mindfulness. And then for right samadhi or right concentration, they have to be completely done away with. Moreover, with right concentration, we find that there are things that are not even immoral in the mind, but are coarse. They keep the mind in a more basic state, that if we were to do away with them, the mind would become brighter and more clear and more relaxed. And so this right samadhi is actually the point where we begin to intuit that certain things that are not even like coarse defilements nevertheless prevent the mind from its full potential, and we begin to see them as defilements. And it's funny that you would look at something like ecstatic joy as a defilement, But if your mind is close enough to a higher level of concentration, then it's like, wow, that's really disturbing. If I were to do away with that, then my mind would be even more peaceful, clear, and bright. Why don't I just do away with that? Well, that's the whole thing we're doing with the whole Eightfold Path. But that's really the culmination of it, yeah, where we see it at its best and brightest. So we have these parts, the Eightfold Path, and there, it's funny. I've talked about these in a bunch of other talks. I'll talk about them in a bunch of future talks. Some of you, like Jim and Laura, you actually, you've heard them, and I've covered them in other parts, and um, it's perennial. We cycle back through, and there's something really magical about looking at these things. I thought also in terms of the Eightfold Path, it's one thing to know what these are, but then to look as I am at all of you, across the top of the screen, and to see your faces and to know that these are the faces of people who are practicing the Eightfold Path. So what is this actually in terms of human life? It's one thing to open a book, and I got tons of books behind me, and they've all got the Eightfold Path in them, right? These are all Buddhist books behind me. And I see Jim, and I know Andrew. I everybody's got all of these books, and all the books have all the Eightfold Path. But is reading it really, does it change anything? No, because I'm looking out at all of you, and I can't see whether or not you're living the Eightfold Path right now. I can't see. There's no halos. Maybe Zoom is kind of filtering that out, but I doubt it. It's just the reality of the Eightfold Path is something slightly different from the intellectual idea. The intellectual idea has us like breaking it into these different chunks. But what is it when we're actually doing it? The reality is the path itself is not eight things, is just really this one thing, is about the end of suffering, the way that we develop the end of suffering. And it's curious that we use this term practice, yeah, and it's like you practice something to get better at it. But when we talk about the Eightfold Path, we're using the word practice. We're practicing life. Yeah, we're practicing, but that really is a good word because we're trying to get better at life. And this is one of the amazing parts of the path itself, is it's the recognition that we could be better at life. Even though everybody here, if you were to stop, full stop, all the Buddhist stuff right now and go and just be like anybody off the street or anybody on the television and just live out the rest of your life, then you would have gotten as far as you've gotten right now. Yeah. But you would be living. So why do we practice? Well, I think anybody who is given a little bit of attention to these things, they know that there's a certain um, pleasure and happiness that is derived simply from doing these things themselves. So just the fact that I can see all of you means that you've got your video, you're listening, you're like attending to this, you want to learn something. You sometimes smile when I say something. There's like feedback. You're conscious. And that just shows that just like there is a certain amount of intention involved in what you're doing. Yeah. And why? Why would you be doing this as opposed to any other thing? And that's the thing, is that the path itself, even though it sounds like effort, it sounds like development, is that development is actually something that we want, right? When we really understand the conditions of life, we understand that one of the conditions of unhappiness, of dukkha, is to not apply ourselves, right? We don't want to be stagnant. We don't want to just stay where we're at. We have guaranteed suffering that we're going to experience in this very life. We want to do something about it. And so the Buddha, is very clear that it's our suffering that motivates us to get out of suffering. And lo and behold, we've got some, yeah, and it won't get better without practice. But should we practice, we find that the practice itself alleviates some of the suffering. It alleviates the suffering of being idle, being passive, and just having to go along with it. Okay? We have a term, it's called path consciousness. Magga is the word for path, is actually used in this concept. So I think I've always liked reflecting on this. Of course, hearing the Eightfold Path and chanting it and breaking it into all the little bits is wonderful because you can recognize the things that you do every day and the things that the practitioners that you know and respect and who are your friends on the path, they're doing these things all the time. And every moment of recognition is bright and beautiful. But from time to time, I zoom out and I say, but there is something greater, something more powerful to this Eightfold Path, in that it really describes one who is working for the end of suffering. It's like describing a person, describing a life, describing an inclination towards non-suffering in all of its many facets. And just the way that I would struggle and I would need multiple facets to describe any one of you, to say nothing of like the whole Sangha, the fourfold Sangha, of all the various individuals. You would need a lot of different words and a lot of different concepts and a lot of different systems to describe the people who are capable of enlightenment. The Eightfold Path is doing that, but those descriptions would always be pointing to a person. And just as the Buddha said, wherever you find an enlightened being, you find this Eightfold Path. In some ways, you can look at any person who has attained this path consciousness and you see these qualities of the Eightfold Path playing out in their life. It has affected the way they think. Has it affected the way they speak? It's affected the way they act. And it's affected just their ability to apply themselves in the most fundamental way. And path consciousness is an interesting thing just to apply our minds to, because it's suggesting that merely hearing the Eightfold Path or merely doing any one part of this Eightfold Path is not enlightenment. Yeah. And it should be very clear if you've seen any Sangha that you've probably suspected, it's like, well, I'm not sure they totally get it yet, but they're trying. And that person over there, they've been doing this for a long time, but off and on. And we just don't know. We don't know, but we might suspect that some of us are still working at it. But working at it and applying ourselves. But then there's something that changes, and you meet somebody, or you hear a teaching, or you experience something, and you're like, well, there's something fundamentally different, and you can't really describe what it is. And that's getting at the fact that the Eightfold Path is describing something that actually breaks our reality to a degree. We can describe all the different facets, but when we're trying to talk about enlightenment, we realize we're trying to talk about something that's non-conditioned with conditions. We're trying to use finite thoughts to describe something that's infinite. And so it doesn't really work. But nevertheless, we can intuit when we're coming into contact or coming into proximity to that Eightfold Path, to that infinite realm, or to that freedom, because certain things just don't seem to be applying anymore. Yeah, so something is different. And those who've described enlightenment experiences are usually describing some dramatic mental event, and we can't cultivate that. It's one of the paradoxes of being a Buddhist practitioner, is that the only thing we can cultivate are conditions. We can cultivate thoughts, we can cultivate speech, we can cultivate actions. Yeah. But we can't cultivate a moment of non-thought, non-speech, and non-actions because we would have to use thoughts, speech, and actions to do it. So what the Eightfold Path is also pointing to is how we open up this gap to see Nibbana, to see that which is unconditioned. We've got to use conditions to do it. And so we practice and we practice and we separate ourselves from the causes of our suffering. We create these conditions for nirodha, for processes that have been playing out since the moment we were conceived to stop, to end, and to go silent. But then the really fantastic thing is when we have undercut the very condition for them to arise in the future. And now, in order to perceive that, we would have to perceive nothing because that's what's happened. Yeah. And this is the third noble truth. It's like it actually takes a moment of recognition, of realization, of aha, to get what Nirodha is talking about. Because it's not simply, oh, I was angry and now I'm not. But it's that hard, almost impossible to describe moment where we know we're not going to get angry in the future from this thing. When we've seen through something, we've maybe had this moment where we realize, oh, that person is just like me, or oh, I do that all the time, or oh, this is miserable and I can totally let it go. I do not need to be doing this all the time. That moment of recognition is recognizing the non-arising. We've recognized that we've severed some sort of causal link, which means we've taken control. And this is what the Eightfold Path really, points to, is that moment of control where, where it ceases to describe a finite, predictable thing built of conditions. And it's describing that moment where the unconditioned is jumping in and taking precedence. And that's the amazing thing. So the practice itself is beautiful. The conditions themselves are not the worst conditions. Like to be truthful, to be compassionate, to be concentrated, to be filled with joy, to be able to apply ourselves to wholesome mind states. All of these are good things. But what it's trying to describe is what's described in its name. It is the path that we take to the cessation of suffering, to the end of suffering, and to the non-arising of future suffering. That is in itself. And it happens in stages. Yeah. So just as we can say, it's like, well, I practice and I practice and I practice. But that moment where the unconditioned kind of jumps in, it was based on our practice. It was dependent on our practice. But it has nothing to do with the practice because the practice was built of conditions. In that moment, there's no going back. Yeah. Because you can't put the conditions back together once you've finally separated them, once you've finally cut the causal link that creates suffering. There's no more going back. So this is the thing. It starts with ignorance. Yeah, you've now, if you've heard all these talks, you've heard other people talk about them. You know the Four Noble Truths. You know there is suffering. Yeah, you know that suffering is ultimately coming from craving, clinging, identification, this thirst for experience. Many people, this is just the most bizarre, thing. It's like, I like thirsting for experience. I want to exist. But for somebody who's actually gotten and had a vision of, the Four Noble Truths, all of these little pieces are falling into place. And they're like, yeah, but if I let go of that vicious, painful thirst for existence, I'd still get existence, but I'd be letting go of the vicious, painful thirst. Yeah. I can have my cake and eat it too, all I have to do is just give up the wanting and the needing and the identifying. Yeah. And we have the duties, to the Four Noble Truths. Yeah. We want to understand, we want to abandon, we want to realize. But all of them come about through cultivation. Yeah. It's funny, in order to understand suffering, and to be practicing the Eightfold Path. You're not going to understand suffering if you're in the middle of, running around murdering people. It just doesn't work that way. But if you stop murdering for a little while, you might be able to see how much suffering is involved with that way of life. Yeah. It's actually dependent on the ending of that particular activity, because you can't imagine, you can't intuit what it feels like to not do a thing until you actually see the end of it. Yeah. So every stage of development is dependent on giving it a try. But having given it a try, then it starts to build and build and build. So we have the Four Noble Truths. They all refer to each other. But it's this fourth noble truth that's really describing the aha moment, what brings all of this, together. And it brings it together, like I said, at a moment that's impossible to describe, but is, earth shattering, and those beings who describe this, they, in some ways, they describe it with conditions, because how else could they? But often what they're describing is simply a knowledge that arose, and it arises after the fact. Like nibbana is the end of craving, or it's done, I'm free, I'm liberated, the holy life has been lived. They will have this knowledge, and like the knowledge is conditioned, but it's arising spontaneously in their mind in response to something that is non-conditioned. And that's impossible to just get through any other way. Yeah. So we go and we cultivate and we practice. And at some point in the future, this will happen. Yeah. This moment will happen. And when it does, ignorance is shattered, is destroyed, and it can no longer arise in the future. And at that point, you can say that the Eightfold Path is there every moment. Being who has attained some stage of awakening can't fall away from the Eightfold Path. It lives within them, this understanding and this resonance of the unconditioned, of nibbana. You will look for them to produce suffering, and they will fail to do it time and time again. This is one of the most amazing things of those beings that I have confidence are fully enlightened, and I've met them. And in terms of what's tangible, what you can point to, they're kind of old and simple and humble and easy to overlook. Yeah, they're nice. They're not super special, but it's in terms of what they don't do that really shows the incredible depth of their cultivation, the way they don't get angry, the way they don't get attached, the way they don't snap at you, the way that they don't begrudge anything, the way that they instantly let go of things. Yeah, as though they never picked them up in the first place. That's what's special, and they can't not do it. It's just become built in. That's what I said. That's when you realize that this Eightfold Path is, it's eight things that's trying to use conditions to describe one thing, one special thing, and that is what this is all for. Yeah, enlightenment, freedom, liberation, nirodha. So there's a lot of words, and we'll have a chance for some Q&A or discussion if anybody would like to go over that. But otherwise, this is just wrapping up a look at the Four Noble Truths. Encourage you, if you suspect that there's something here that it would have been useful, you can go back and listen to the other talks. The recordings are out there. But otherwise, just stick around. Yeah, this is the easiest prescription. Just keep hanging, just keep swimming in this pond, keep socializing in these circles. It'll come back around, and you'll hear them again and again and again, and it will develop and develop, and your understanding will be fleshed out. and you will see it in practice in other people. And so if you continue on this path, then you will reach its destination without having to think of it in linear terms. It's more of a certainty. If you make practicing your baseline, well, then you are living the life as it describes. So whatever is useful, take with you, and whatever is useless, leave behind. Leave it on the side of the path and just keep walking.